Dear God in heaven, we thank you for your helping us with information to decipher what's happening around us. Please help us to navigate this history. Help us to look back and understand the past. Bless us as we try and understand the arguments of the two streams of information. Help us to understand these things so that we can successfully navigate this history. Bless us now, and please send your Holy Spirit to guide and direct us. In Jesus' name, amen. I've put this up on the board to hopefully trigger some memories from some of you. So we're going back at what we're going to be doing today is partly reviewing some of a presentation from a three-part presentation from Brazil, which was part of the Vespers programs. It was about in the middle there somewhere. And this was partly a review on the beginning illustrates the end from the 26th of the 3rd, 2022. I think it's about the 8th, around the 8th Vesper. And so we're going to go back here, briefly remind us what we were looking at. And originally we had this primary question, and what is the sin of the USA? And I know you can't really see that because of the lights, but that's just saying, what is the sin of the USA? And we basically spend a number of presentations looking at the history of pre-Civil War. And we looked at the culture war that played out through this history between the North and the South, or the socially conservative versus the socially liberal. And we went through these histories, and that's culture war got played out in the churches, and it split those up. And eventually, got so bad that it split the entire country into two groups, and it ended up into the Civil War. And so today, we've spent quite a bit of time on looking at what that culture war, what they were fighting about. And yes, one side was for slavery, the other side was against slavery. But the arguments to defend their position, we found, was the South would consistently invoke freedom and religious liberty to defend their position of slavery. And no matter what example or event in that history, no matter what event occurred through here, that culture war fought, that fight, the freedom and religious liberty were consistently invoked by the Southern Confederates. And the abolition side, the South, obviously they were fighting for a position of equality. Now that's oversimplifying that history. And as you can see, there was intervention, and the South would see that as you're intervening and go back, intervening and causing problems. Stop trying to take our freedom. We can't even speak freely anymore. Stop interfering, sort your own problems out. And so there was the South would consistently see this intervention as an attack on them. And we get to it wasn't just intervention going that way. Obviously, when we get to the Fugitive Slave Act, there you see the South trying to intervene in a sense, and intervening and forcing their narrative onto the northern states with the Fugitive Slave Act, where you've got to track and hunt down these slaves and return that property back to the South. And so we talked about that. We also perhaps did a slight detour on the last one I did, where we talked about libertarianism, what libertarian looks like when it's played out into the geopolitical world. And we used the example of Germany and Russia, where Germany in its behavior towards Russia, practiced the principles of libertarianism. And as a result of that, you end up with the annexation of Crimea. And, they practiced that libertarianism towards Russia being hostile. And you ended up with the invasion of Ukraine. So, when libertarian is practiced in the geopolitical world, you end up with human rights violations. And we also looked at, well, it doesn't just play out in dynamics between countries, it also plays out in individuals. And so we looked at how libertarianism, when played out and practiced even on a personal level in our families, in our churches, in our communities, it can be used, or when you don't intervene, you end up, abuse ends up being a consequence. When you don't have a check on something, abuse ends up occurring. And just like Germany became an indirect instrument of aggression towards Ukraine just by their behavior with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, they basically end up funding Russia's war machine. So just like Germany was an instrument of aggression towards Ukraine, as a person, if you're not intervening and, putting a check on abuse, well, you indirectly can become an instrument of aggression. No, that's fine. So that's what we've looked at so far. And so we're at the Civil War. And so today, what we're going to be looking at is what the rhetoric, the language, the dialogue, the arguments. We want to look at the arguments of this side and also bring it to the present, because that's why we're doing this. We're looking at this stuff so we can look at the present and make sense of the world we live in. So what I'm going to do, this brings us to the Civil War. Now, slavery, which doesn't surprise me, peaked in 1860. Slavery peaked right here at this moment. And there was about 31.5 million people in the USA at that time in 1860. Now, just under 4 million people were slaves. So that's 12.5%, or just a bit over. That's 12.5% of the entire population, North and South. That's a significant amount of people of the population. So in slave-holding states, about 4.9% of people own slaves. Now that's a bit hard to comprehend. So when I looked at the data, it was easier to break it down to households. So just to make more sense. So 24.9% of households own slaves. This is in the set I've gone from national now to state. So, on the South, 24.9% of households own slaves. Now, this data, we want to look at it a bit closer so we get a bit more of a picture, because in Mississippi, about 50% of households own slaves. In South Carolina, 46% own slaves. But then when you go to some of the border states, you've only got 3% of families would own slaves, like Delaware or Maryland, where 12% own slaves. So the southern states are not created equal, if you know what I mean, when it comes to slavery. Some have a high percentage, some barely have any. So the median percentage for slaveholding states was about 27%. That's families. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put one of the main things we want to look at. Remember, there's 31.5 million people in the entire country. So that's broken down in the north, having 23 million. We'll do it the right color so we can see it clearly. 23 million people. So therefore, the south had 4 million people. That's really telling. And so when we look at the southern states, of that 4 million people, remember 27% of families own slaves. So that brings us to about 1.35 million people own slaves. But let's break that down to families, because the average family back then had 6 to 8 children. If you could give me a little bit of leeway, let's just include the parents and say there's 10 people per family. So they had big families back then on average.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Are the slaves included in the population?
Okay, good question. Okay, I made a mistake. Thank you for picking that up. The South complete population was 9 million people, of which 4 million are slaves. So you've got 5 million who are not slaves. That's nearly half the population. It's significant. Okay. Thank you for picking that up. So here we are. We've got 9 million people. We've got to take 4 million people because there's 4 million slaves. So you're left with 5 million people. Now, of that 5 million people, 27% own slaves as essentially 27% of families. So if we broke that down, it's 1.35 million people, of which are made up of families. So let's say there's 135,000 families own slaves. Everyone okay with that so far? There's 135,000 families that own slaves. Okay. But you've got, in the South, we're not worrying about the North at the moment. In the South, you've still got quite a number. So you got 135,000 or 1.35 million people who own slaves. Therefore, you've got 3.65 million who don't own slaves. No slaves. Okay. 135,000 families own slaves, approximately. You've got 3.65 million who have no slaves. So you're talking about a third, a third or less own slaves. So you're talking about more of a minority, more of an elite, wealthier plantation owners, farmers, those who actually just own slaves and then hire them out to slave masters to farms. So you're talking about, an elite, more of the wealthy side. Because down the South don't really have manufacturing and things like that. That's all more in the North. So it's an agricultural based society. And those who have the slaves have the wealth. So my point here is, why are we even looking at this? You've got here's my question. How do you convince the South, the majority, the 2/3, how do you convince the 2/3 of Southerners who don't own slaves at this moment to fight and die to protect slavery or the elite's wealth? How do you convince 2/3 of the population in the South to put their life on the line to protect the wealth of those third? They put your life on the line to protect the minority's wealth. That's the question. You can answer that now if you like, or I'll keep going. And that's where I guess it comes down to, they must have had compelling reasons, compelling arguments, compelling rhetoric, compelling language to convince people to put their lives on the line. Remember that 2/3, they didn't own slaves. The elite, a lot of them didn't even like. So a lot of these people didn't even like that wealthier group. And then the South will do something just around here. They'll bring in the law saying something like, if you own 20 or more slaves, you don't even have to fight in the Civil War. That's a law that was brought into the South. So if you own 20 more slaves, you don't even have to fight. You can just go home, look after your 20 slaves or more. So here's a group that are fighting and dying for the elite to protect their wealth, to protect the institution of slavery. They're the ones putting their life. And then those who... So what I'm saying is, we've got... The rhetoric must have been very, very compelling. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Yes.
Did the slaves understand what the Civil War was about? That the North were fighting for their freedom and the South, etc. Because why I'm asking that is, you said those that had 20 or more slaves would have to go home and look after them. In other words, were they going home to keep them under control?
Correct. That was the argument to defend that law.
Yeah.
We need to... but why, if I was part of that 2/3, why would I care? I don't even necessarily like slavery. Why am I'm not even that comfortable with it. And yet here I am going,
is it like
holding a gun and going and fighting in this war?
Is it like today business, it protects, it helps the economy, so it helps their way of life to some degree. If you destroy it, are they going to be worse off? I don't know.
Sort of, and we're basically addressing that. That's what we're gonna break down, because something was going on that convinced these people, and it must have been very, very... That's basically what we're going to be looking at. Okay, everyone okay with that so far? All right. This brings us one of the primary truths of Vespers and the Midnight Cry, where the breakdown of the left and right, which is similar to back here. The South prioritised freedom over the equality, and vice versa. The left or the North would prioritise equality over the freedom of the Southern stateholders to own slaves as property. They're saying you don't have that freedom. And that's basically our political spectrum. So I'll just put it up here. I might do it a little bit differently. I might do it like that. And we'll go right. I'll do it color coded so we can reference it back to the antebellum period. Left. So this is freedom over equality and equality over freedom. That's the ethos. This is the ethos. That ethos of the left and the ethos of the right. So right wing prioritizes freedom over equality. And there are different people within this right wing group over here. One group will say, I can see that equality has its place, but freedom has to be foundation and above everything. An example, and this is part of the review of that Vespers we're talking about. So the example was the wage gap between men and women. They say the wage gap exists and it's not ideal or not even great. So this is group one. It's not ideal or great, but that change has to come through society changing itself. The government can't intervene, so no government intervention, no force or pressure applied, because force or pressure from the government impacts people's freedom and companies' freedoms, because companies need to be able to employ who they want and pay them what they want. The moment government interferes in businesses, you're taking their freedom. So that's group one. So you've got group one. So the right is made up of different groups. So group one is, they're saying equality is okay. Okay with equality, but freedom is critical. But freedom is foundation. Sorry for putting my back to you. I'll go this way. There's another group. Group two says, no, there is no wage gap. Inequality doesn't even exist. It's a myth. And feminists are a part of a left-wing agenda to suppress and hurt men. So there's another group within this right wing. Group two. Group two says there is no wage gap. Inequality doesn't exist. Does not exist. Inequality does not exist. Group two. Group three says a wage gap does exist and it should, because they believe in no equality because women should know their place. So the right wing, so wage gap, sure, there is a wage gap. And there's supposed to be a wage gap. Wage gap does exist, yes. Inequality does exist, and it should. It's necessary, absolutely need inequality. Women should know their place. Three groups. So the right wing at its core ethos, the whole ethos of the right, prioritizes freedom over equality, which is one of the core truths of Vespers and the Midnight Cry. Okay. That's number one. It's all of them, but we're focusing on number one because that's the core ethos of number one. But because of that, it becomes a safe place for group number two and group number three. And that's why you have someone like Enrique Tarrio, who isn't white. He's Cuban. He's the leader of the Proud Boys. He says he is not racist. So he's saying he's not number 3. And he will be angry that the Proud Boys are seen as having white supremacist links, and all he is doing is prioritizing freedom over equality. And by the way, they do have white supremacist links, particularly the founder. But he's sitting there, he's fighting, but he's not. He's saying, I'm not racist. He's a person of color himself. But this ethos that Enrique stands for, it does 2 things. And this is what we're going to keep coming back to. It does 2 things. One, this ethos that Enrique is invoking and projecting, and that's the way he lives his life, this freedom over equality, it creates a safe place for much uglier thinking. So it creates a safe place for, I'll just say, bad stuff. Creates a safe place for bad stuff, ugly thinking, ugly things. It also in other words, number 2 and number 3, inequality doesn't exist anyway. It's rubbish. There is no racial or gender inequality in the US. Or number 3, there is racial and gender inequality in the US, and there absolutely should be. So they're the ugliness that it makes a safe place for. Enrique can't see that it is adherence to number 1 supports and foments and makes number 2 and 3 possible. But we're going to come back to Enrique shortly. And when the media looks at them, the Proud Boys or anyone else, the media will focus on number 3. Just like if they were covering a flood, and I'll test this example as well. If the media was covering a flood or a storm or storm damage, the cameras and reporters would focus and concentrate on the absolute worst areas, the most flooded, the most damaged areas. Ignore the thousands of acres. Ignore the thousands of acres that are partly flooded or a little bit of damage. They'll zero in on the epicenter of the problem. And so, again, the media would focus on number 3, the white supremacists, the bad, the ugliest. They would focus on number 3, whether it's the freedom truckers in Canada or January 6th. They would focus on the ugliest component of what was going on there. But what we're dealing with the entire package. And in a sense, so far in what we've done here, when we're focused on here, when we've done quotes in the past, we're focused on characters like John C. Calhoun, who would be considered in group number 2 or 3. So in a sense, we've sort of done that. We're focused on the epicenter with characters like John C. Calhoun. And I'm not sure how it has its place, and we need to understand that. But we want to see the arguments of, we want to see the 3.65 million, what they were saying and how they were justifying their position. We don't really want to be focusing on, even though that's what we've been focusing on here, because John C. Calhoun and others like that who were in group 2 and 3, they were fighting for freedom and religious liberty, and they were invoking they had very strong racist, ugly statements. But that back then, when clear, abrasive statements on slavery were very uncommon, because how you can't convince 3.65 million people to join in the fight if your argument is slavery. So we'll keep going. Okay. So I guess, in a sense, the cameras, when focusing on the storms or when they're focusing on the humans side of it, they're not focusing on the thousands of people there in support of free speech and who aren't holding the white supremacist slogans. So that's where the media isn't focusing, and that's where we need to focus. We want to focus on the silent majority. We want to understand their arguments. We want to understand this here, because that is what makes 2 and 3 possible. Remember group 1. Now let's bring this back to the antebellum period. So antebellum, okay, so the antebellum period is, for those of you who don't know, it's a period of time between 1817 and 1861. So it's basically the period from the War of 1817, which was between the USA and Great Britain, when Great Britain were invading, or when I say invading, they were invading the shipping lines of the trade routes of America. So that they had a conflict there. And so antebellum is between there and the start of the Civil War. And antebellum, by definition, actually means before the war. Antebellum, that's what it means, before the war, before the Civil War, that's what it's saying. So every time I say antebellum, you know that it's between the early 1800s and the Civil War. It's in that gap there. And so the whole topic of this study is, what is the arguments that the South used, this antebellum period, the slaveholding Southern Confederate states during the antebellum period? What rhetoric, language, arguments did they have? That's what this is about. Okay. So we're going to bring it back to the antebellum period. And so if I was in the antebellum period and I'm group 1, I'm talking about group 1. I'm part of 3.6 million people. Don't necessarily agree with slavery. I can see that there are some good points with abolition, possibly. It has merit. Maybe I'm a little uncomfortable with slavery. It's not ideal, but abolition, or the freedom of slaves, has to come through society changing. No government interference, no government intervention, no force or pressure applied from the government to bring abolition. Because if the government uses force or pressure, it impacts and takes the freedom of the farmers and the businesses to operate in the way they want to. What we need to do is hear all the facts and use truth and science. We need to use reason. We need to hear the arguments from the farmers, the plantation owners. They need to have a say. They have free speech. We need to use science and not ignore the experiences of the past history. What's past history going to tell them? For centuries, there's been slavery. So, they're going, even if they look into their past history, they're going to see slavery, and slavery is okay. We need freedom of speech and diversity of thought. You can't cancel the pro-slavery conversation just because you disagree with them. So this is group number 1. I'm trying to bring the antebellum period to these groups. Liberty of speech and conscience is what makes this country great. It's bedrock. Freedom, the bedrock of this country, has to be paramount, even if people disagree. And also we need civility. Sounds pretty nice to me. Okay. Again, it's a little bit difficult to do a direct comparison to groups 2 and 3 back to the antebellum period, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay. Let's start with group number 3. Let's start with the ugliest. Slavery is as natural as breathing itself and necessary. Our ideological cornerstone, so this is a quote from Alexander Stephens. He's the Confederate vice president in this history. This is what he said. Our ideological cornerstone rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. In other words, inequality does exist and it should. Slavery has always existed, does exist, and will always exist. Slavery was natural because if whites could work the sweltering South Carolina rice fields, they would. The constitutions of black men, on the other hand, were perfectly adapted. Group 3. Okay. Group number 2. This is a bit more difficult to see. The physical condition of the American Negro is on the whole not comparatively alone. In other words, the American Negro is not on their own in this plight, but positively good. And he is exempt from those racking anxieties that exacerbates of despair to which the English manufacturer and the peasant are subject to in the pursuit of their pittance. So, in other words, you're actually in a better position. Because if you had to be an English manufacturer or a peasant, you've got all these other responsibilities. You've actually got all these racking anxieties that exacerbates of despair. American Negroes don't have that. So who are the real victims here? You've got the lower middle class and the poor. So, and that was from Robert Walsh. That's like saying inequality doesn't exist because look at all these other white people. Look at they're even in a, look how bad it is for them. You're actually, you're actually in a really good position. It doesn't exist. Inequality doesn't exist. What wage gap? Another example of number 2, Richard Nisbet. A Negro may be said to have fewer cares and less reason to be anxious about tomorrow than any other individual or of our species. They may be pronounced happier than the common people of many of the governments in Europe. So they are happier, less anxious about tomorrow. They've got less cares and less worries. So who are the victims here? Who has all the worries and the problems? So who are the victims? Not the slaves. It's not fair. Inequality doesn't exist. Look at the extra stuff white people have to deal with. That's I'm sort of paraphrasing as we go. So, who are the victims? The white people. Look at the extra responsibilities white people have to deal with. So John C. Calhoun says slavery is a positive good. So John C. Calhoun, he exists in 3 and he bounces to 2. Because he says it's a positive good, but he says inequality does exist and it should. It's how it is. It's how God designed it. Okay. So my point here is so far we've focused on characters like John C. Calhoun, but he isn't who we need to see. We need to see what makes his position possible in the first place. We need to see the group that they don't necessarily agree with. They don't agree with slavery or don't like it, but we need to ensure liberty, freedom of speech, and diversity of thought is foundation. We need to see group one. We need to see their speech, rhetoric, ideas, arguments, and thoughts. Because this is the reasoning of group number one, even though the ethos is the whole, all three groups, the ethos of group number one is what the Sunday law is about. It's solidifying. The Sunday law will solidify group number one. It will solidify that ethos. The country will be finally cemented in their course. They're cemented in prioritizing freedom over equality. And it'll be done by using the compelling, strong arguments of group number one, not the arguments of slavery is good. Okay. Quote, this is Kyle Rittenhouse. Does everyone remember who Kyle Rittenhouse is? He was one of the, he was a 17-year-old who arrived at a Black Lives Matter protest when there was a bit of social unrest in Wisconsin, in Kenosha. And he, as a 17-year-old, shot 3 people and 2 of them died. So if we remember Kyle Rittenhouse, this is his quote. I told everyone there I had to do it. I was just attacked. This is also a quote from that Vesper study. I was dizzy. I was vomiting. I couldn't breathe. This case has nothing to do with race. It had to do with the right to self-defense. I'm not a racist person. So what's Kyle saying? I'm not number 3. I'm number 1. I support Black Lives Matters movement. He doesn't support their ideology, but he'll support their right to freely demonstrate, peacefully protest. So he supports that, doesn't support the ideology, of course. So he's saying, of course, people have the right to demonstrate peacefully. Of course, that is the principle of freedom, and also has a right to go there with a gun and shoot people in self-defense. So he has that right too. He has a right to go and shoot people in self-defense. And this is getting to the heart of right-wing thinking. And the point here is when the media focuses on the epicenter and calls all this white supremacy, it's not helpful because it distracts from what's really going on and the underlying thing that causes the ugliness in the first place. So now we're gonna look at a number of quotes. This is from the Reasonable Rebels. I'm not going to share screen. This was an article Elder Tess put in the broadcast, I think twice, maybe 3 times. Said of all the documents she's put in the media broadcast, there's 3 that really, 2 or 3 that really need reviewing over and over and over again. And this was one of them. It was one of the last documents she recommended, and said it's really important to go back and look at this. So the Reasonable Rebels. Who are the rebels? The slaveholding southern states. The rebels, the reasonable ones. 3.65, the reasonable ones, not the John C. Calhouns, the reasonable arguments, the ones who were fighting for and had compelling arguments that weren't slavery is great. All right, so I'm just going to read from here. Paragraph number 1. After the El Paso shooting, let's back up again. This was the El Paso shooting was the shooting that occurred in Texas, the Texas Walmart, where a far-right person killed 23 people and injured 23 more. And it was considered domestic terrorism and a hate crime, and described as the deadliest attack on Latinos in modern American history. So this is the context that Ben Shapiro was talking about. After the El Paso shooting, Ben Shapiro, a popular conservative podcaster, asked Americans to draw a line between the few conservatives who are white supremacists, group 3, and those who, like him, aren't. Almost all Americans are on the same side, he said, and we should be mourning together. In his telling, we aren't for one simple reason. Too many on the political left are castigating the character of those who disagree, lumping conservatives and political nonconformists together with racists and xenophobes. So what's Ben saying? He's saying, he's like Kyle, I'm not a racist. I'm in group 1. Kyle's in group 1. Ben Shapiro's in group 1.
He's a victim.
He's a victim. And he's basically saying we're all on the same side. All of us are on the same side, left and right. We should be mourning together. The only reason we are divided is because the left does something. And what's the left doing? Castigating the character of those who disagree. What does castigating mean? Castigating, reprimanding, rebuking, hauling over the coals. So the left is rebuking the right. The left is rebuking them. And so he's saying the only reason we're being separated is because the left is rebuking the right. And basically lumping them all into the same group. They're saying, oh, you're all in group 3. And so it's exactly like what John said there. You can see the victimhood coming through. And so it's the left who is causing the problem. It's the left who is separating us. In other words, Ben Shapiro is basically saying, stop character assassinating me. Stop defaming me as a racist. So who is Ben Shapiro? Ben, he is part of a group that could be called the Reasonable Right. That's what this document is about. It's about comparing the history of the antebellum period and the rhetoric and the language, and comparing it to the more, because you got reasonable rebels back then, but you've got the reasonable right now, and it's a compare and contrast to those two things. All right. So the reasonable right also includes other people like radio commentator Dave Rubin, legal scholar Amy Wax and Jordan Peterson, and social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, New York Times columnist Barry Weiss, Christina Hoff Summers, Bret Easton Ellis, and podcaster Sam Harris. And I'm hoping there's a number of those names that should just blare up with flashing lights. We've got Sam Harris on the end there as well. Considered part of, according to this document, part of the reasonable right. So quote 2. Okay. Not all these figures, the names I just read out, identify as right-wing. They typically dislike President Trump, but say they're being pushed rightward or driven to defend the rights of conservatives by intolerance and extremists on the left. So if you're being pushed rightward, is it your choice? In their mind, you're being forced to do this. And why are you being forced to do this? Because this intolerant and extreme left wing is who's the one being attacked here? according to them. Yeah. The conservative, I'm now, the conservatives are being attacked. Now I'm a reasonable person. I think everyone has freedom and rights. I'm seeing I have to move right to defend not just them, but everyone. I have to defend everyone's freedom from this intolerance, this extremism. The left saying you can't do that. You can't. You're not free to say that or do that. So remember, the ethos of freedom over equality does two things. A, it creates a safe place for bad stuff. That's what this ethos creates, a safe place for bad stuff. And it does something else. And John has already mentioned it. The perpetrators see themselves as the victims. We're going to keep seeing this over and over and over again. Every time we read a quote, more often than not, you're going to see those principles being demonstrated, because that's the core ethos, and that ethos causes those two things. Okay. I'll read another quote. They, the reasonable right that we just talked about, they're just symbols of a broader community, but they're like leaders of the reasonable right. They present their concerns as principally freedom of speech and diversity of thought. Weiss has called them, we'll stop there. So I'll say that again. They present their concerns as principally freedom of speech and diversity of thought. And so now the author is saying, so it felt frustrating when I read Weiss and then I listened to Shapiro, when I watched Jordan Peterson or read the supposedly heterodox online magazine Quillette, what was I reminded of? I finally figured it out. The reasonable rights rhetoric, Jordan Peterson and co, is exactly the same as the antebellum rhetoric I'd read so much of, the exact same words, the exact same arguments, rhetoric to be precise, in support of the slave-owning South. So that's what I talked about before. There's a direct comparison with the language, the rhetoric, the arguments is exactly the same, or sometimes word for word, that was used back in this history to this reasonable right who say they are in group number one, who they would even consider themselves in the middle, because remember, they're being pushed right to defend people. They see themselves as mid-ground, level-headed, science-based, fact-based guardians of American foundational principles. So they're the guardians. They're almost like on a righteous quest. It just so happens that they always defend rightward. I don't really see them defend leftward that often, if at all. And there's a reason for that. We'll go into, we might not make it today, but we'll get to that. Okay. And so that's the main point. We want to see these arguments of the past and then see them in the present. And we want to see how strong and compelling they are, because it's convinced millions of people back then when the population was quite small. Now let's go back to Enrique Tario. So from the perspective of race, what group is he in? 1, 2, or 3? happy for input if anyone wants to answer. What group would Enrique Tarrio from race? Remember, he's a person of color. He's saying, I'm not racist. He's saying what Ben Shapiro and Kyle Rittenhouse are saying.
Group one.
In group one. All right, so from that story, that perspective, he's group one. What about from the perspective of gender? What group is Enrique Tarrio on?
What's his gender?
Well, he's leader of the Proud Boys.
Not the three.
All right, so a quote from Enrique. I denounce white supremacy. I denounce anti-Semitism. I denounce racism. I denounce fascism. I denounce communism and any other ism that is prejudiced towards people because of their race, religion, culture, tone of skin. I'm pretty brown. I'm Cuban. There's nothing white supremacist about me. Very strong statement. But what did Enrique leave out?
Women.
He left out sexism and homophobia. So he will fight to the point of physical violence to defend freedom, particularly when it clashes with the left, all right, who are defending people's equality. So if you were to become if you were to progress in the Proud Boys institution or group, to achieve third level initiation into the Proud Boys, you must get a tattoo with the acronym POYB, which stands for Proud of Your Boy. And the other tattoo you have to get says Ahuru, which is Swahilian for the word freedom. So to progress in that that institution, that group, you need to basically be branded with sexism and freedom simultaneously. And so the Proud Boys describe themselves as Western chauvinists. The Anti-Defamation League, the Proud Boys are a right-wing extremist group with a violent agenda. They are primarily misogynistic, Islamophobic, transphobic, and anti-immigration. The Proud Boys represent an unconventional strain of American right-wing extremism. While the group can be described as violent, nationalistic, Islamophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic, its members represent a range of ethnic backgrounds, and its leaders vehemently protest any allegations of racism.
Isn't anti-immigration?
Like I said, it's complicated and it's in there. But, you know, they've got their arguments as to why. But I guess my point is he's, you know, if you're looking from Enrique's point of view, he might be group number one when it comes to race. But when it comes to gender, he's certainly not in group number one. Okay. So depending on your story can depend where you find yourself. You might be number one on one topic and number two or number three on another. But principally, the ethos of freedom over equality causes those two things. It causes a safe place for number two and number three. And the ethos causes the perpetrators to see themselves as the victims. All right. So we've sort of introduced some things. Where would you find Lucifer? Which group would you find Lucifer in?
To begin with, I'd say number one.
John's saying number one to begin with. Has anyone got any other thoughts? Share screen.
All he was fighting for was freedom.
And he didn't believe in equality.
Can I just confirm that everyone can see that before I go on?
Yep.
Thank you. All right, great controversy, 499.2. Okay. If it's okay, I'll keep it at that size for everyone at home. I'll read 499.2. To the very close of the controversy in heaven. So this is in heaven, they're about to be kicked out. So they've had their culture war, they've had their political fight, they've had their arguments. All right. The great usurper continued to justify himself when it was announced that with all his sympathizers, he must be expelled from the abodes of bliss. Then the rebel leader boldly avowed his contempt for the Creator's law. He reiterated his claim that angels needed no control, but should be left to follow their own will, which would ever guide them right. I find that interesting language, guide them right, but anyway. He denounced the divine statutes as a restriction of their liberty and declared that it was his purpose to secure the abolition of law. Abolition is to abolish something. So you're stopping, you're ending, you're terminating, you're quashing. So you're stopping. I've lost my spot now. Here we go. It's on the side there. So it was his purpose to secure the end of law or the stopping of law that freed from this restraint, the hosts of heaven might enter upon a more exalted, more glorious state of existence. When you think about that, you know, the promise there is a more glorious state of existence. It's almost like the promise of like a utopia, like you're gonna, and it reminds me of libertarianism, what that promises. It promises a society of utopian society where everyone has freedom and everyone's living their best selves. And so this is the promise. Okay. So they want, so this is Lucifer, they want freedom from restraint. And Lucifer is working, he's fighting for the freedom of the angels from the overbearing, overarching government of God. Freed the angels from God's control, because they even say the word control right here. Angels need no control. In other words, Lucifer's saying God's controlling them. We need to stop that control. We'll keep going. Let's go to great controversy. We'll go to the next 399.3. With one accord, Satan and his host threw the blame of their rebellion wholly upon Christ, declaring if they had not been reproved, they would never have rebelled. This stubborn and defiant in their disloyalty, seeking vainly to overthrow the government of God, yet blasphemously claiming to be themselves the innocent victims of oppressive power. The arch rebel and all his sympathizers were at last banished from heaven. Lots of things in even this little paragraph. So again, God's done something. What they're blaming? So whose fault is it? Christ's fault. Why? What did Lucifer and his host think was happening? They've just been reproved. Hang on. That sounds familiar. The first thing we actually read from Ben Shapiro. The reason why we are separated is because too many on the political left castigate the character or reprove the character of those who disagree. So the reproof, if you didn't reprove us, we wouldn't have rebelled. So it's your fault. You reproved us, and that's what separated us. This is exactly the same argument Lucifer had back then as to what I've just read in the first paragraph from Ben Shapiro. What group is Ben Shapiro in again? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Group one.
Group 1. All right. So, okay. So remember, Lucifer was the architect of this ethos. He's the architect. So this ethos of prioritizing freedom, which we see over and over again, liberty, freedom, stop controlling. We need to get rid of law, unrestricted freedom. Remember, this ethos causes two things. It creates a safe place for bad stuff. It creates a place for group 2 and 3. It makes that possible. And also the perpetrators see themselves as victims. So we haven't really seen the ugly stuff yet. It's ugly, but we haven't really seen the bad stuff yet. Because this is the initial, this is like the beginning of the ethos. This is the beginning of this is the deceptive. Remember, the promise is a utopian society. This is actually a great thing. We need to change this government of God because it's too controlling, too much law. We want more of a utopian society. We want to live in this wonderful place. That's the argument. Lucifer and the angels see themselves as innocent victims of oppressive power, because didn't it say that? In unity, they all blame Christ for their rebellion, declaring if they had not been reproved, they would never have rebelled. So we've gone through that. And we've compared that as well. Great Controversy 500.2. We're just going to stay here for a little bit. By the same misrepresentation of this, so here we are, right here. By the same misrepresentation of the character of God as he had practiced in heaven, causing him to be regarded as severe and tyrannical, Satan introduced man to sin. And having succeeded thus far, he declared that God's unjust restrictions had led to man's fall, as they had led to his own rebellion. Okay. I'll keep going. What did I do there? Let me keep going. 501.1. I'm just going to read the first sentence. In the contest between Christ and Satan during the Saviour's earthly ministry, the character of the great deceiver was unmasked. So, hang on. Here we've got, why did it take thousands of years for Satan to be unmasked?
Is it meant to be dead with Christ?
So now we're starting to see ugly stuff. I'm not saying we're starting to, but this is where this ethos leads. What did it lead to? It led to killing God, amongst other things. So this ethos, and let me read that again. So in the contest between Christ and Satan during the Saviour's earthly ministry, the character of the great deceiver was unmasked. Nothing could so effectually have uprooted Satan from the affections of the heavenly angels and the whole loyal universe as did his cruel warfare upon the world's Redeemer. So again, the whole universe is looking down at these two options. The option of God's government with restraint and the option of Lucifer's government with no restraint. And we're starting now, the unmasking, they're starting to see the consequences. They're starting to see too. They've seen it for thousands of years, but this is just like another thing that's just gone. This is what happens under this ethos. Okay. So the ethos of Lucifer's government causes groups 2 and 3, and it allows sexism, racism, and it ends up killing God. It's where Satan was unmasked progressively through this earth's history. And you can see why God, in his wisdom, he had to let it play out, because we look at this and we go, oh yeah, that's easy to see, but hang on, this ethos that Satan developed, it convinced 2/3 of the angels. That's the majority of the angels. Only when Christ stepped in and said, oh, he entered the politics or the arguments and started defending the position, only did he get that third back. So this wasn't easy to see then. Again, group 1, the ethos allows group 2 and group 3 to be possible. Okay. We'll do one more. 502.1. You notice we're hanging around here. Now the guilt of Satan stood forth without excuse. He had revealed his true character as a liar and a murderer. It was seen that the very same spirit with which he ruled the children of men who were under his power, he would have manifested had he had been permitted to control the inhabitants of heaven. He had claimed that the transgression of God's law would bring liberty and exaltation, but it was seen to result in bondage and degradation. So again, he's claiming that, or Lucifer is claiming that changing God's government or lifting the restraint of God's law would bring liberty and exaltation, which is libertarianism. That was the promise, but what instead did it bring? Bondage and degradation. It brings sexism and racism. It brings 2 and 3. So this ethos, it looks great until it's demonstrated. It also, what's interesting here, it also says exaltation, as though the inhabitants would enter into a higher plane of existence, which is similar to libertarianism. Throw off all restraint of law and have absolute freedom, and society will eventually develop into a utopian type of community. And we've gone into what that looked like with Germany and the interaction between Germany and Russia. Now, let's just do maybe one more while we're here. 497.1. Now, I know we've gone through a lot of quotes, but God in his wisdom permitted Satan to carry forward his work until the spirit of disaffection ripened into active revolt. It was necessary for his plans to be fully developed, that their true nature and tendency might be seen by all, because obviously it can't see it at the start. Lucifer, as the anointed cherub, had been highly exalted. He was greatly loved by the heavenly beings, and his influence over them was strong. Actually, I'll stop there. I'll just read it again. God in his wisdom permitted Satan to carry forward his work until a spirit of disaffection ripened into active revolt. It was necessary for his plans to be fully developed, that their true nature and tendency might be seen by all. I'll stop there. So even the loyal angels could not fully discern his character or see where his work was leading. So what's his work? he's doing a work here. His political ethos, remember, he's trying to bring about a different form of government, a government ethos. That's his work. Even the loyal angels couldn't see where that was heading. Okay. I'll one more and then I'll 497.2 because Satan had been so highly honored and all his acts were so clothed with mystery that it was difficult to disclose to the angels the true nature of his work. Until fully developed, sin would not appear the evil thing that it was. Okay. This is something that had to develop. And until it was developed, it wouldn't look bad. It doesn't look bad. And that's the deceptiveness of group number one. If you fully develop the ethos of unrestricted freedom from God's law of equality, sin would not appear that bad. So when you develop the ethos of group number one, you give it time, you will get group number 2 and 3. So when Eve and Adam chose this ethos, so what did they choose? They just chose to be in group number 1. How long did it take for sexism? When they said, I don't want to be restrained by God's law, I want to live in this utopian society and be elevated like a god. How long did it take for group 2 and 3 to appear? We know the answer on race. If we go to Ham, it took generations. So if we go to, it took generations for sexism to appear. So this ethos turns into degradation and subjugation. It ends up in 2 and 3. It makes a safe place for 2 and 3.
The ethos of victimhood more or less comes straight away then.
Yeah, exactly right. Straight away, the victimhood came in. Whose fault is it? Well, it's yours, God, because you gave me. Oh, hang on. No, it's yours. You gave me Eve. Hang on. No, it's yours, God, because you let the serpent in here. So the victimhood is right there. So 1 and 2 is going to keep popping up. We're going to stop there. And we will do a part 2 and finish some thoughts. And I guess we start a brief summary to close. We asked a question at the start, what actually convinced 3.5 million non-slave owners to fight and die for the slave owners or the wealthy plantation owners? It's only the introduction, but I'm hoping people can see the rhetoric. And Abraham Lincoln, he knew the threat. So much so, he faced... Abraham, we've got another quote here, but we won't do it. We'll do it next time. Abraham Lincoln understood the dynamic of what was going on here. So he focused more his attention on fighting the rhetoric of that brought about this group, as opposed to the rhetoric of this group, because he saw the danger of the language and rhetoric that they were using, the rhetoric of freedom and reason. And what ended up happening, these antebellum arguments, what ended up happening, it drafted because of the language that was used, that was framed in freedom and common sense and reason because it was framed in that way, even though those people were wary of slavery, what ended up happening, the rhetoric took the focus off group 2 and 3, and it focused it on group number 1. And what it ended up happening, because it ended up, it created as though it wasn't a fight over slavery. It was broad, it was created and argued that it was a much bigger fight. And it was a fight to preserve American institution itself. And so the focus was completely taken away from 2 and 3, and the arguments were framed in a way that,
Well, it would say that it made them victims.
yeah, it certainly made them victims. What it ended up doing, using this I might read a note that I've put here, using this antebellum reasoning, using freedom and reason, it conscripted allies who had no taste for slavery or bad stuff of groups 2 and 3. It conscripted them. But what using this language did was cast the conflict, this culture war, it cast it into a much broader fight. So it was no longer about slavery. No, it's so much bigger than that. If they came for slavery, in other words, I'm using their argument, if they're prepared to come for slavery, everything's on the table. All our freedoms will be stripped. And that's where, they start using hyperbole and straw man arguments. And that's for another time we'll go into. But I guess it's like using the rhetoric. Using this rhetoric is like going from a handheld fishing net to get allies in this fight, to getting a fishing trawler and dropping out kilometers of ocean line out the back, ocean netting. That's the comparison. When they start reframed it into this argument, they branded it as a much bigger fight. It's not about slavery. This is about the common core of our very existence. Now that's like throwing a big fishing net out the back of a trawler, and then you're going to get schools of fish. You're going to get sharks, and every now and then you get a big whale. So we'll stop there. Sorry, was someone going to say something before I
was just going to ask you to stop share screen, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Forgot about that. So what we'll do, we'll close, and we'll close with a prayer. And if anyone has any comments, questions, we'll address them then. So if you can deal with me. Holy God, we thank you for this day of life. We thank you for the messages that you're giving us for some time now. We thank you for them. Help us as we go about our day to ponder and think about these things, and help it change us so that we can be more reflect who you are. Help us as we make changes, as we hear the rain. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.